Let's start here. Oswald moved from Fort Worth to Dallas in October of 1962, and on the 15th he registered at the Y, and on the 19th he checked out of the Y. And Mrs. Tobias, who managed the apartments on Hellbeth Street, said that Oswald rented the apartment there on November 3rd, and he could very well have moved in that day or the next day, she's not sure. So what this means is that from October 19th, 1962, at least until November 3rd, 1962, Oswald's address is unknown. And let's just note here that Jack Ruby, during this period, did have a membership at this same location of the YMCA. So he and Oswald could very well have crossed paths there. And I want to review this timeline for Marina moving out of the Hellbeth Street apartment and moving in with the Mellors, the Fords, and the Rays. Accounts from various people, including Alex Kleinlerner and Gary Taylor, helped to establish this timeline. And here in this FBI report, Anna Mellor describes how it is that Marina came to move in with her. And one night, probably in November 1962, she received a phone call about 11 p.m. from Mrs. Oswald. Mrs. Oswald told her in Russian that her husband had beaten her and she did not have any money to secure lodging. Mrs. Miller stated she told her to take a taxi and that she would pay the fare. Thereafter, Mrs. Oswald and the baby stayed with Mr. and Mrs. Mellor in their apartment in Dallas. After the expiration of the first week at her apartment, Mrs. Oswald stayed at the home of Mrs. Delkin Ford. And that fits our timeline here. And then after the Fords, Marina moved in with the Rays, and on that very same day, which can be determined to be November 17th, she moved back to Hellbeth Street with Oswald. And this is corroborated by Mrs. Tobias, who said that she first saw Marina Oswald about 2 weeks after Lee Oswald had rented the apartment. It was about 2 weeks from November 3rd, 1962, that Mrs. Tobias first saw Marina. Marina moved back in on November 17th, 1962, after having lived with the Mellors, the Fords, and the Rays. So this is a pretty tight story and a pretty tight timeline, corroborated by many different people. But then enter George de Mohrenschildt. This is his first word on the record of his involvement in Marina moving from Hellbeth Street. And it comes from an interview of him by somebody from the U.S. State Department in Haiti, because that's where he was living at the time. Theo Mellor and his wife, who is Russian. Mrs. Mellor is an engineering draftsman. He probably means Mr. Mellor. He works in Sanger's department store in Dallas as head of stock or something like that. They have no children. They took care of Marina Oswald and her baby for a while when Mrs. Oswald first was separated from her husband. The de Mohrenschildts had moved Mrs. Oswald on that occasion from the Hellbeth Street address to the Mellors. So de Mohrenschildt apparently said in this interview that he moved Marina to the Mellors, when the story we have, of course, is that's not what happened. Mrs. Mellor and Marina, in her own Warren Commission testimony, her first session, said that Marina went to the telephone and called Mellor, and then went to Mellor's in a cab. She was not moved by de Mohrenschildt, according to this story. And this story was brought up by Mr. Jenner while he was interviewing de Mohrenschildt, because Marina had already been interviewed at this time and had told the other story. Marina recalls when they lived on Hellbeth Street, she had a dispute with Lee and about her Russian friends, in which he said, well, if you like your friends so much, then go ahead and live with them. And she said that left her no choice, so she got in a cab and went over to Anna Mellor's house with the baby. Oh, is that how she described it? Well, we took her there, but maybe she went there for the second time, you see. Well, she may have forgotten you took her. Yes, maybe she forgot it. You know, we took all the furniture also. I could not forget that because my car was loaded. You could practically feel the ground. I still have the same car in Haiti today. We had a tremendous load in our car. It took us the whole day to load and unload and carry them. Now, subsequent to this, Marina was interviewed again, and she did adjust her story so that the Mohrenschildt story could fit correctly. I think that adjustment was a lie to accommodate what de Mohrenschildt said. And we don't have anything from Anna Meller to corroborate George de Mohrenschildt moving all of this stuff into their one-bedroom apartment. I think if that had happened, that Anna Meller would have said something about it. But we do have corroboration from Mrs. Tobias that a man with a convertible did come over to the apartment and did move Marina and a lot of stuff in his convertible out of the apartment. So apparently something like this did happen. And that was on a Sunday afternoon, and it was sometime between the 3rd and the 27th. Tobias knows it has to be before the 27th because the circumstances on this day had her husband driving their car, and on the 27th he got in an accident and could no longer drive the car. So Tobias says it has to be between the 3rd and the 27th of November. But this is a problem for the official story timeline because this would have to be November 4th, the Sunday that Marina moved into Elsbeth. It would have to have happened on the same day she moved into Elsbeth, and it's in the afternoon, and they had only moved, according to the trailer rental information that we get from Kleinlerner, they moved that afternoon to Elsbeth. So for the de Mohrenschildt story to be true, he would have to move them out of Elsbeth on the same Sunday afternoon that they moved into Elsbeth, and that seems very unlikely. And also, Meller said that she was called on Monday evening by Marina. So how could Marina have called her Monday evening and asked her if she could move in if de Mohrenschildt had already moved her the day before? And it's even better than that. According to Mrs. Tobias, she hadn't even seen Marina until the 17th. And this was after she had already moved out and come back again, though Mrs. Tobias didn't know that. But she couldn't have seen Marina moving out before she knew she had moved in. So what that means is the man with the convertible had to have come to move Marina after November 17th. So the convertible move has to be between November 17th and November 27th. It has to have occurred after Marina had already lived with the Mellers, the Fords, and the Rays. The convertible move must have come after that, and yet de Mohrenschildt says that he moved her to the Mellers, so de Mohrenschildt's story cannot be true. Now, Jenner asked Tobias what this man looked like, and she said he was a pretty good-sized fellow. He was larger than Oswald. But she never could say how tall he was. She never said he was taller than Oswald. All she said really was that he was larger than Oswald. And I'll note here that Jack Ruby is larger than Oswald. How old was this man? Gee, I don't know. What is your judgment? Well, perhaps 50. 50, I would say, or even in his late 50s. All right, how was he dressed? He had on a brown suit. Was he neatly dressed? Yes, he was. He didn't have slacks on? Well, I think that was a suit. He didn't wear shorts? Oh, no. So the guy is 50-ish, and George de Mohrenschildt and Jack Ruby were born in the same year, about a month apart. They're both the same age. And Jenner asks if he was wearing shorts because George de Mohrenschildt would often wear shorts. The story about de Mohrenschildt's dressing habits is that he usually did not wear a suit, that he usually dressed casually, even wearing a bathing suit or shorts, and this was a Sunday, and de Mohrenschildt said he didn't go play tennis because he had to go do this. And it seems very unlikely to me that George de Mohrenschildt, who doesn't usually wear a business suit unless he's doing business, it seems very unlikely to me that he would wear a business suit on a Sunday to go help move Marina from Hellbeth Street. Yet Jack Ruby always wore a suit. And Mrs. Tobias here says that the FBI brought by photographs of a man named George, presumably George de Mohrenschildt, but she thought that the man that came over did not look like this person called George. But when she saw pictures of Jack Ruby on the television after he had shot Oswald, then to her mind, this guy that came over to move Marina out in the convertible, that looked like Jack Ruby. It didn't look like George de Mohrenschildt, it looked like Jack Ruby. And as I've already mentioned, Jack Ruby was a member of the YMCA at the same time that Oswald was living there. And George de Mohrenschildt's story cannot be true as he told it, or as Marina confirmed it, because it doesn't fit the timeline, which is corroborated by many different people in different ways. And now Tobias thinks the man looked like Ruby. I think it was Ruby. I think de Mohrenschildt was instructed to create his story in order to make an explanation available for this that was not Ruby, and because they knew that Tobias had seen Ruby at Hellbeth Street. So they had to make a different story because they knew this would be talked about by Tobias. And if you casually examine the evidence, it works. You accept that it was de Mohrenschildt, but I think it was actually Jack Ruby. And I think also this can possibly explain the weirdness of the U-Haul trailer truck rental. We don't have a receipt for the trailer rental that Gary Taylor rented for the first move on November 4th. But we do have a receipt with Gary Taylor's name on it for a trailer rental on November 30th. This trailer was returned on December 2nd, and this would probably be the trailer that was rented to bring the stuff back to Hellbeth after the convertible had moved it away from wherever it was moved to. And note on here, underlined in green, the rental apparently had been handled by an individual by the name of Hellbeth. Hellbeth is an extremely uncommon name. I don't think the person was named Hellbeth, but notice how similar it sounds to Elsbeth. It's as if the person who filled out this rental receipt knew that it was going to be used in regards to the Hellbeth Street place and referred to it jokingly as Hellbeth because it was a dump probably. And that person was writing up the U-Haul receipts. So I think this means that either Oswald or Ruby had a connection at this U-Haul rental place who would do little favors for them. And I think one of the little favors was to lose the first receipt, the real Gary Taylor receipt, and the other little favor here was to fill out this receipt with Gary Taylor's name on it, but with incorrect information elsewhere, and with a signature on it that's not Gary Taylor's, and in order to confuse the evidence so you couldn't be sure about anything. And this might also explain why Oswald had in his address book the telephone number of the mechanics department at the Winfield garage. Perhaps the contact worked at the Winfield garage as a mechanic, and perhaps he worked part-time at this service station, and perhaps he was the guy who could write up receipts the way they wanted them written up. And this number to the Winfield garage that Oswald had in his address book just happened to be changed on the day before the assassination. So I think it was Ruby with the convertible, and probably Jack Ruby provided Oswald with a place to stay for that 2 weeks where we don't know where he was.